Every year around early November, baseball fans face a tough realization that they'll have to wait an entire year for a hammered Rob Manfred to give out the World Series trophy.
But the Texas Rangers are World Series champions.
But that presentation also means another World Series champion was crowned, and another World Series came to an end. And in this video, we're going to look at all the World Series in the 21st century and put them in tiers based on competitiveness and their historic and memorable moments. And I'll try to look at the series from the perspective of a neutral fan, as obviously every fan loves any series their team won or was at least involved in. So let's look at the best series the MLB scriptwriters came up with.
Totally sports-esque. Majorly.
We of course start in the year 2000, and the new century gave us the ultimate version of the Subway Series. The Mets got there by defeating the Giants, then the Cardinals for their fourth pennant in franchise history. And the Yankees got there by beating the A's and the Mariners for their third straight pennant and fourth in 5 years. Really, the most memorable part of this series was that it was the Subway Series. But for a 5-game series, it was pretty good. The best game of the series was the first game that started with Billy Joel singing the national anthem, and starting on the mound disguised as Andy Pettitte. Him and Al Leiter traded zeros until the bottom of the 6th when the Yankees scored 2. But then 1 inning later, the Mets took the lead with 3 runs, and that 3-2 score would hold until the bottom of the 9th. After Posada flew out, the Yankees got a walk and 2 singles. Then Chuck Knobloch hit a sac fly to tie the game. Things would go to extras and remain scoreless with 1-2-3 innings by Mariano Rivera and Mike Stanton. Then in the 12th, the Yankees would load the bases and Jose Vizcaino would hit a walk-off single. The next night would give us another 1-run game that wasn't as close as the score indicates, as the Mets scored 5 in the 9th to make things close. One of the wildest moments in MLB history happened in this game when Roger Clemens chucked half of a broken bat at Piazza. That definitely wasn't a result of roid rage, and was definitely because Clemens was pumped up and initially thought that bat was a ball. And when things went to Shea, all 3 games were decided by 2 runs or less. The Mets picked up their only win in Game 3, then after a Jeter leadoff home run, the Yankees won another 1-run game in Game 4. Then in Game 5, it was another close game. Al Leiter pitched into the 9th with a pitch count well over 100, and just like the next World Series Game 5 the Mets would play in, the decision to keep their starter in led to some controversy after the Yankees were able to play 2 runs to take a 4-2 lead. And after Mike Piazza made the entire city of New York lose their breath for a second with his deep fly ball to center, the Yankees were able to win their 3rd straight World Series. The fact that this was the Subway Series does help with the significance, but nonetheless, this was a great series for only going 5 games. And I'm going to put it in the B tier, which may or may not be generous. Next up is the 2001 World Series, and once again, the Yankees are involved, after beating the A's and the 116-win Mariners for their 4th straight pennant. And they went up against the Diamondbacks, who beat the Cardinals and the Braves to make the World Series in just their 3rd year of existence. If you watched my video where I go more in depth about this series, and if you know anything about this series, you already know it was an absolute classic. It was an emotional series in the wake of 9/11, and it delivered everything and more. The only knock is that 2 of these games were blowouts, and Game 2 felt like a blowout with Randy Johnson on the mound. But the rest of the games were great, especially Games 4 and 5. Both nights the Yankees hit a game-tying 2-run home run in the 9th off Byung-Hyun Kim, then hit walk-offs and extras. Then Game 7 was one of the best ever, with Alfonso Soriano's go-ahead home run in the 8th, and Mariano Rivera would blow his first save since 1997 when Tony Womack hit a game-tying double. Then Luis Gonzalez had a walk-off loop single to give the young Diamondbacks a title over the powerhouse Yankees, giving us one of the greatest endings to one of the greatest World Series. So if you already knew about this series, you already know that it may be the most obvious S-tier choice of the century. And we move to 2002, which was the first ever wild-card World Series matchup. The Yankees were finally defeated by the Angels, then the Angels beat the Twins to make the World Series. And for the Giants, they beat the Braves, then the Cardinals, and Barry Bonds was finally going to get his World Series shot. And he made the most of it right away, by hitting a solo home run in his first at-bat. And this would prove to be very important as the Giants will win Game 1 by 1. The next night gave us one of the wildest games in World Series history that ended with 21 runs and 28 hits, of which 6 were home runs, with none being bigger than Tim Salmon's go-ahead 2-run home run in the 9th that added 37% to the Angels' win probability. And after Barry Bonds had a solo home run that this YouTube video described as the furthest baseball ever hit, the score was 11-10, which ended up being the final score. The 3-game trip to San Francisco featured Barry Bonds becoming the first to ever hit a home run in his first 3 World Series games, and Dusty Baker's son running on the field in the middle of a potential play at the plate. It luckily didn't end bad as the Giants went up 3-2. Then Game 6 gave us one of the greatest World Series comebacks of all time. The Giants were up 5-0 going to the 7th with a 97% chance to win the World Series. But then, the Angels used the power of the Rally Monkey to score 3 in the 7th on a Scott Spiezio home run, then score another 3 in the 8th on a Darren Erceg home run and a Troy Gloss double as the Angels won 6-5. Then the next night, the Angels won 4-1 for their first and only World Series title. Every game in this series was either down to the wire or featured incredible offense, which was to be expected in this era for whatever reason. But ultimately, this is one of the most underrated World Series of all time and deserves to be in the S tier. And while they took a year off, the Yankees were back the next year in 2003 after beating the Twins and beating the Red Sox in 7 after Aaron Boone's walk-off home run. And they went up against the Marlins, who beat the Giants, that made a 3-1 comeback against the Cubs that was blamed on a certain scapegoat, and extended 2 famous curses one more year. This was the first year of home field advantage being decided in the All-Star Game and the American League One, so things started in New York. And the Yankees lost their first World Series home game in 7 years after losing Game 1. But they rebounded in Game 2. The road Yankees won Game 3 despite 7 one-run innings from Josh Beckett. Game 4 would be the best of the series. In front of almost 66,000, the Marlins jumped out to a 3-0 lead thanks to some rookie named Miguel Cabrera hitting a 2-run home run off Roger Clemens. The game remained 3-1 going to the 9th when Ruben Sierra hit a game-tying triple, and after a scoreless bottom half, the game went to extras. The Yankees blew an opportunity to score with the bases loaded in the 11th, and things were still 3-3 going to the 12th. After a scoreless top half, on the 8th pitch from Jeff Weaver, Alex Gonzalez had a walk-off home run despite going 5 for 53 in the postseason to that point. In Game 5, the Marlins took a 6-1 lead, and though the Yankees slowly clawed back, they didn't have enough, as they lost 6-4. Then in Game 6, a 23-year-old Josh Beckett blanked the Yankees in Yankee Stadium as the Marlins won their second World Series despite never winning the division. And for the second time in 3 years, the Yankees lost to an expansion team from the 90s. This was a pretty good series, and it looked like the Marlins' young stars would lead them to a dynasty. But then, they just decided it was better to lose their young stars. I'm going to put this series in the B tier. And we move to 2004, featuring the 105-win Cardinals, who got to the World Series after beating the Dodgers, then the Astros in 7 games in the NLCS. And they went up against the very definition of a team of destiny in the Boston Red Sox. They swept the Angels, and after going down 3-0 against the Yankees in the ALCS, they won 2 5-hour extra inning games in Boston. Then they went to New York and beat the Yankees twice to become the first team to ever come back from a 3-0 deficit. And ultimately, the ALCS was more memorable than the World Series. Game 1 was a great game, with the unsung heroics of Mark Bellhorn and his go-ahead 2-run home run in the bottom of the 8th. And while the next 3 weren't necessarily blowouts, the Red Sox pitching absolutely shut down the Cardinals' offense that was one of the best they ever had, as they went on to win their first World Series in 86 years and break the curse of the Bambino. And that fact alone really carried this World Series, as on its own, this series wasn't competitive. And it'd be easy to put this in the bottom tiers, but the historical significance puts this in the C tier. And we move to 2005, and this featured a team making their first World Series and one playing in their first since 1959. The Astros made their first trip by beating the Braves in 18 innings in Game 4 of the NLDS, then avenging the Cardinals by beating them in the NLCS. On the other side, the White Sox swept the defending champs in the Battle of the Sox, then completed a gentleman's sweep over the Angels. And spoiler alert, we got another sweep in the World Series, but this is what is known as a competitive sweep. Game 1 saw a back-and-forth start before Big Boy Jinx closed the game out for a 2-run victory. Then Game 2 gave the White Sox arguably the best game in their history. After going down 4-2 in the 7th, Paul Konerko hit a grand slam. Big Boy Jinx would come in for the 9th, but unlike Game 1, he could not close it out, as the Astros tied the game at 4. Then Scott Piseknik became one of the most out-of-nowhere World Series heroes when, despite hitting 0 regular season home runs, he hit a walk-off solo home run off Brad Lidge to put the White Sox up 2-0. Game 3 gave us another classic and the longest World Series game in history by time. The White Sox put up a 5 spot in the 5th to take the lead, but the Astros made another late-game comeback when they tied the game on a Jason Lane double. And after a scoreless 9th, the game went to extras. and after multiple innings with runners on, no one could score until the 14th when Jeff Blum hit a solo home run. They would tack on another run as they won 7-5 in 5 hours and 41 minutes. And in Game 4, Freddie Garcia and Brandon Back both had shutouts to the 7th, but the first and only run of the game scored when Jermaine Dye hit a go-ahead single off Brad Lidge. Then after stopping 2 rallies, the White Sox would win Game 4 1-0, giving them their first title in 88 years, which was a longer drought than the Red Sox, which seems to be forgotten, but nonetheless is still a historic win. Though it was a sweep, it was still as good as a 4-game series can get, and with historic value, I'm going to put this series in the B tier. And in 2006, we got a rematch of the 1968 World Series. After the Tigers beat the Yankees in the ALDS, Magglio Ordonez had a walk-off home run to send the Tigers to the World Series for the first time in 22 years. As for the Cardinals, despite only winning 83 games, they got into the playoffs and beat the Padres, then froze the Mets in Game 7 to win their second pennant in 3 years. And ultimately, this World Series is one that was memorable only if you're a Tigers or Cardinal fan, or a baseball junkie. The Tigers seemed to play flat after an extended break after the sweep of the A's, while the Cardinals played a 7-game series. Cardinal fans will particularly remember the performance of David Eckstein, who delivered the biggest moment in the series when he hit a go-ahead double in the 8th inning of Game 4. But while almost all these games are close, outside of Game 4, these games weren't very compelling. And considering the Cardinals were the worst team to ever win the World Series, it takes some away from it. So ultimately, I had to put this series in the F tier. And we moved to 2007. Just like 2005, we saw a team making the first ever trip to the World Series, only this one came out of nowhere. Going into the World Series, the Rockies had won an insane 21 out of 22 games, including a sweep of the Phillies and Diamondbacks, and a controversial win in the NL tiebreaker over the Padres. And on the other side, the Red Sox were back after 2004. After they beat the Angels, and despite falling down 3-1, they came back against Cleveland in the ALCS, giving us another situation where one team had a break, while the other played 7. And this time, the Rockies seemed to play flat. They got blown out in Game 1, and scored only 1 run in Game 2 off one of the best postseason pitchers of all time, Curt Schilling, in a tight game. Then in Game 3, the Red Sox took advantage of the Coors error by scoring 6 in the 3rd, and later adding 4 more in the longest 9-inning game in World Series history. Then in Game 4, the Red Sox struck first, and added 3 more over the next 7 innings. But in the 8th, the Rockies started to make a comeback, adding 2 to make it a 1-run game. But then, they went down in order in the 9th to complete the sweep for the Red Sox, making them 8-0 in the last 2 World Series. This series was a case of a Cinderella team that was overmatched, and just like last year, this series was not compelling. As you may expect, this is going in the F tier. And we moved to 2008, and once again, we got a team coming out of nowhere to make their first World Series, and this time it was the Tampa Bay Rays. They would make the World Series after beating the White Sox and the defending champion Red Sox in 7 games in the ALCS. And they went up against the Phillies, who beat the Brewers and the Dodgers to make their first World Series in 15 years. The first World Series game played on artificial turf in the beautiful Tropicana Field started quickly when Chase Utley hit a 2-run home run in the first. They added another in the 4th, and that would be enough, as unlike the 2005 World Series, Brad Lidge would complete the save. Game 2 saw the first ever World Series win in Tropicana Field, as the Rays won 4-2. Things went to Philly, and Game 3 became the least watched game in World Series history at the time because there was an hour-and-a-half rain delay, and the game didn't start until after 10. And for those who went to sleep, they missed probably the best game of the series. The Phillies led 4-1 after the 6th, but the Rays were able to come back in the 8th. Then with the game still tied in the bottom of the 9th, Eric Bruntlund was hit by a pitch, then made it to 3rd on an error. Grant Balfour was walked, then Carlos Ruiz came up and hit an absolute bomb that went 45 feet. But it was enough, and the Phillies took the series lead. Game 4 would be a blowout, then Game 5 would give us more weather problems. After the Rays tied the game in the 6th, the game was delayed, and the rain kept falling, delaying the end of the game for 2 days. The game would pick up on the 29th and the 6th, where the Phillies took the lead. The Rays tied it in the 7th, but then the Phillies retook the lead in the 7th, and this time for good, as they went on to win their second World Series. This series felt like the year prior, with a team coming out of nowhere then getting beat by what seemed like a better team, though the Rays won 97 games and weren't necessarily Cinderellas. But ultimately, while the series had some good games, outside of Philly and the incredibly passionate fans in Tampa, for many, this series was pretty forgettable, and the rain delays didn't help. I'm putting this in the D tier. And in 2009, we would once again see the Phillies after they beat the Rockies and the Dodgers again in the NLCS, and they would go up against the Yankees, who beat the Twins and the Angels, to give us a matchup of two of the most obnoxious fan bases in sports. Game 1 was all Cliff Lee, as he became the first pitcher in World Series history to throw a complete game with 10 strikeouts and no earned runs, and Chase Utley would hit 2 home runs for good measure. Game 2 went to the Yankees after big home runs hit by Mark Teixeira and Hideki Matsui, and a few controversial calls that went the Yankees' way. Things went to Philly, and just like the year prior, Game 3 started late due to rain, and when things finally got underway, the Phillies scored 3 in the second, but the Yankees responded with 2 in the fourth and 3 in the fifth, including the game-tying single hit by Andy Pettitte. The Phillies continued to score, including 2 home runs hit by Jason Worth, but it wasn't enough, as the Yankees took the series lead. 3 runs would score in the first to start Game 4, and the game would go back and forth with multiple lead changes. The Phillies tied the game in the 8th and brought in Brad Lidge for the 9th. He would get 2 quick outs, then Johnny Damon would hit a single. He would then steal second, and with no one covering third, he took that as well. Teixeira would get hit by a pitch, then A-Rod hit a go-ahead double, and the Yankees added 2 more to win 7-4. In an elimination game, the Phillies went down in the top of the first. Bo responded with a 3-run home run by Chase Utley in the bottom half. The Phillies led the entire game after this despite a late comeback by the Yankees. Chase Utley would have another multi-homer game, which tied Reggie Jackson's record for most home runs in a series, as for the first time in 6 years, a Game 6 was going to be played. In that Game 6, Pedro Martinez and Andy Pettitte both made their final World Series starts, and the Yankees struck first with a 2-run home run hit by Hideki Matsui, and they never lost the lead, as they went on to win 7-3 to clinch their 27th World Series. This series was easily the best in a while, and the drama was heightened by the fan bases and attention. Regardless, this was a very good series that goes right in the B tier. Moving to 2010, for the 3rd time in 4 years, a team was appearing in the World Series for the first time, and this time, it was the Texas Rangers, who got there by defeating the Rays and the defending champion Yankees, and they went up against the Giants, who got there by defeating the Braves and the Phillies. The Rangers went up early in Game 1, but the Giants tied things up in the 3rd before blowing the game open with a 6-run 5th. That was enough in a high-scoring game, won by back-to-back Cy Young winner Tim Lincecum. Game 2 was a pitcher's duel until the 5th, when gravity refused to give Ian Kinsler a home run. Then the Giants scored and went on to score 8 more. In the first World Series game played in Arlington, every run was scored on a home run, with none bigger than Mitch Moreland's 3-run home run in the 2nd, as the Rangers picked up their first victory. Game 4 saw the birth of World Series Madison Bumgarner, and the second-year Bumgarner threw 8 innings of shutout ball, as the Giants picked up a 4-0 win. Game 5 gave us a great pitching duel between Game 1 starters Cliff Lee and Tim Lincecum, with no runs crossing through the first 6 innings. But then in the 7th, with Lee still pitching, Edgar Renteria hit a 3-run home run, making this the 2nd time he would have the deciding hit in a World Series, as Brian Wilson would shut the door to give the Giants their first World Series win since 1954 when they were in New York. While this series was the end of a long drought and the start of a dynasty, it wasn't very memorable outside of Renteria's home run. I'm going to put this in the D tier. And we move to 2011, which once again featured the Rangers, who got there by beating the Rays and the Tigers in the ALCS. And they went up against the Cardinals, who snuck into the playoffs, then beat the Phillies, then the Brewers in the NLCS. Just like the 2001 series, I went into depth about this series in a previous video, and if you are familiar at all with this series, you know that it was an absolute classic. While most of the attention of this series goes to Game 6, there were great moments throughout the entire series. Game 1 was a back-and-forth game decided by an Alan Craig go-ahead single to write off Alexei Gondo. Then in Game 2, that same situation happened again, but this time the Rangers came back in the 9th to even the series. Game 3 saw one of the greatest offensive performances of all time take place when Albert Pujols set the single-game record for total bases and became the 3rd player to hit 3 home runs in a World Series game. Game 4 saw Derek Holland deliver the performance of his life in a huge game for the Rangers. And Game 5 featured bullpen phone issues that came into play late when the Rangers broke away. Then there was Game 6, which many call the greatest game ever played. For a quick overview, we can just look at the win probability chart and consider the fact that in just the 9th, 10th, and 11th, 4 of the 14 highest championship win probability plays in history for a Game 6 occurred, and none were bigger than David Freese's triple, who in the course of about 45 minutes cemented himself as a postseason legend. Game 7 might have actually been the worst game of the series. but with the intensity of a Game 7, it wasn't that bad. And as you already know, this is as obvious as an S-tier choice can get. And we move to 2012, and we have a Giants return after they came back from a 2-0 deficit against the Reds, then came back from a 3-1 deficit against the defending champion Cardinals to win their second pennant in 3 years. And they went up against the Tigers, who got there by defeating the A's in 5 and sweeping the Yankees in the ALCS. And just like 2006, the Tigers had a long break while their upcoming opponent played 7 games, and its effects were shown again, when their high-powered offense could only score 1 run off Barry Zito. And in Barry's 6 innings, the Giants scored 5 off Justin Verlander. That included 2 home runs from Pablo Sandoval. Then in the 5th, just like Pujols last year, he had a chance for history, and he made history when he hit his 3rd home run of the game, meaning in back-to-back years, we saw a player hit 3 home runs in one game in the World Series. One was completed by the best hitter in his generation, and the other by Albert Pujols. Sandoval didn't hit a 4th home run, though he had a chance, and the Tigers added 2 in the 9th. Then over the next 2 games, the Tigers scored 0 runs, which included another masterful World Series performance by Madison Bumgarner. The Giants only scored 2 runs in each game, but with the Tigers' offense disappearing, that was enough. Then in Game 4, the Tigers broke a 20-inning scoreless streak when Triple Crown winner Miguel Cabrera hit a go-ahead 2-run home run in the 3rd. Both teams hit home runs in the 6th to make the score 3-3, which remained the score as things went to extras. In the 10th, Marco Scutaro would hit a go-ahead single. Then in the bottom of the 10th, Sergio Romo struck out the first 2 batters. Then after battling with Miguel Cabrera, Romo fooled the entire world by throwing a fastball right down the middle to win the Giants' 2nd World Series in 3 years. Aside from Sandoval's historic performance in Game 1, this series was not very memorable, and felt uncompetitive with the Tigers' offense doing absolutely nothing for practically the entire series. I'm going to put this in the F tier. And we move to 2013, and once again, we have a team winning their 2nd pennant in 3 years. And this time, it was the Cardinals, who got there by beating the Pirates, then the Dodgers. And they went up against the Red Sox for a 2004 rematch, and they got there by beating the Rays, then the Tigers. Game 1 saw what the Red Sox had done in the previous 2 World Series, and that's dominate. They scored 5 runs in the first 2 innings, then David Ortiz would later hit a home run as a sign of things to come. In Game 2, we saw rookie Michael Wacha continue his incredible playoff performance, pitching 6 innings, giving up just 2 runs, which came on a 2-run home run to David Ortiz in the 6th. But the next inning, the Cardinals struck back with a sac fly by Carpenter, then a 2-run single by one of the greatest postseason players ever, Carlos Beltran. Despite a scare in the 8th, the Cardinals held on to give the Red Sox their first World Series loss in 10 games. The next game was the highlight of the series. This was a back-and-forth game with multiple lead changes late in the game. The score was 4-4 going to the bottom of the 9th when Molina hit a single, then Alan Craig hit a double. With runners on 3rd and 2nd, John Jay hit a giving us one of the weirdest endings to a World Series game ever. Game 4 gave us another never-seen ending when 3 innings after Johnny Gomes' 3-run home run, with Carlos Beltran up in the 9th in a 2-run game, Colton Wong was picked off at first, making it the first time a postseason game ended on a pickoff. Game 5 didn't have an insane ending, but saw another veteran step up when David Ross had a go-ahead RBI single in the 7th as the Red Sox took a 3-2 series lead. After this game, David Ortiz was hitting .733 with a 2.017 OPS in the series. Game 6 saw Michael Wacha's magical run come to an end when the Red Sox scored 6 runs off him as they went on to win the World Series in Fenway for the first time since 1918. This series had some of the wildest endings in World Series history and maybe the best offensive performance. I'm putting this in the B tier. And we move to 2014 for another World Series featuring the Giants, who got there by becoming the first NL team to make it to the World Series from the wildcard game after beating the Pirates, then beating the Nationals, then beating the Cardinals. And they went up against the first AL team to make it to the World Series from the wildcard game, the Kansas City Royals, who beat the A's, then swept the Angels and the Orioles. Game 1 would end their win streak when the Giants scored 3 in the first, which would be enough for Madison Bumgarner, who had his worst World Series performance ever when he gave up 1 run on a Salvador Perez home run. Game 2 was a tightly contested game until the 6th when the Royals scored 5 runs to tie the series. In Game 3, the Royals struck first in the first, then added 2 more in the 6th. Then the Giants responded with 2 of their own in the same inning, but it wasn't enough as the Royals won 3-2 to take their first series lead. In Game 4, the Royals actually had a 4-1 lead in the 3rd, but after the Giants scored 9 over the 5th, 6th, and 7th, they tied the series convincingly. Game 5 saw the Giants score in the second, and once again, that was all Bumgarner needed, as he threw a complete game shutout as the Giants added 5 runs of insurance for him. Game 6 saw another incredible pitching performance by Yordano Ventura, with 7 shutout innings as the Royals blew out the Giants 10-0 to send things to a Game 7. Going into Game 7, it was a case of when Bumgarner and the Royals' dominant part of their bullpen would come in. After both teams scored 2 in the second, and the Giants took the lead in the fourth, both were in by the start of the fifth. Herrera, Davis, and Holland combined for 0 earned runs, but Bumgarner himself matched them. Bumgarner gave up a single to his first batter, then didn't give up another base runner until Alex Gordon hit a line drive to center that got past Grego Blanco. Gordon raced to third as Brandon Crawford prepared for a play at the plate, but he was stopped, bringing up the only man who's ever scored against Bumgarner in the World Series, Salvador Perez. Then 6 pitches later, he would foul out to Pablo Sandoval as the Giants won their 3rd title in 5 years. This series is carried by the incredible end to Game 7 and the incredible performance of Madison Bumgarner, and was clearly the best series the Giants were involved in this period. I'm putting it in the A tier. And we move to 2015, where the Royals returned after defeating the Astros and the Blue Jays, and they went up against the Mets, making their first appearance since 2000, after defeating the Dodgers, then the Cubs. Game 1 started off wild for the Royals, after Alcides Escobar hit an inside-the-park home run to lead off the game, the first in the World Series since 1929. This game would go back and forth with the Mets taking a late lead in the 8th thanks to an Eric Hosmer error. The Mets still had their 4-3 lead in the bottom of the 9th. Then, with 1 out, Alex Gordon would hit a solo home run to center field to tie the game, which added 14.66% to the Royals' championship win probability, the 4th highest ever for a Game 1. The game would continue all the way to the 14th inning, despite many scoring threats. Then the Royals would load the bases with 1 out, and Eric Hosmer would redeem himself with a game-winning sac fly. Game 2 saw Johnny Cueto throw a complete game shutout, while Game 3 had another stellar pitching performance by Noah Syndergaard, who started the game by throwing over Alcides Escobar's head. Game 4 saw the Mets leading for most of the game until the top of the 8th. After 2 walks, Daniel Murphy made an error at second that allowed the tying run to score. Then Mike Moustakas hit a go-ahead single that would be the difference in Game 4. Game 5 had a similar feel to the last World Series Game 5 the Mets were in. Matt Harvey cruised through 8 innings with a 2-run lead, and after debate, he went out to the mound in the 9th. He walked Lorenzo Cain, then Hosmer hit a double that pulled Harvey from the game. Hosmer got to third on a ground out, then on a ground out to third, Hosmer broke home, and the throw was off the line, which tied the game. The game remained tied until the 12th, when after a Gerard Dyson stolen base, Christian Colon drove him in. The Royals would add another 4 as they went on to win their 2nd World Series. Just like 2000, this series was very good for a 5-game series, and it's going in the same tier as 2000. And we move to 2016, featuring the Indians who got there by beating the Red Sox and the Blue Jays, and they went up against a team making their first appearance since 1945 in the Chicago Cubs, who got there by beating the Giants, then the Dodgers. Obviously, the series was going to be historic no matter what happened, and the only knock on this series is that a few of these games weren't very close. The first 3 games in Cleveland felt one-sided even with the final scores, and Game 4 was the same way in Chicago. But Games 3 and 5 both went down to the wire. The only run in Game 3 was driven in by Coco Crisp in the 7th, and despite picking up 5 hits, the Cubs did not score in the first World Series game in Wrigley since 1945. Game 5 saw Cleveland take an early lead on a Jose Ramirez home run, but Chris Bryant would tie the game on a solo home run as the Cubs tacked on 2 more that inning. Cleveland added another, but couldn't score off Aroldis Chapman, who pitched 2 2/3 innings to keep the Cubs alive. But no matter how the first 6 games went, Game 7 alone puts this series in the S tier. The Cubs looked like they were going to cruise their first title in 108 years until the bottom of the 8th. After a forgotten Brandon Guyer RBI double, Rajai Davis hit a game-tying 2-run home run, adding 39.04% to the Indians' championship win probability, the 4th highest ever. Neither team could score in the 9th, and then the rain started falling down, and in a moment that seemed completely scripted, the 2 teams with the longest World Series droughts were stopped by rain before going to extra innings. And as most know, and was confirmed by Anthony Rizzo, this rain delay was the most important thing that happened to the Cubs. They regrouped, and Kyle Schwarber immediately got on base before being pinch ran for by Albert Amora, who tagged up to second. Then after an intentional walk, Ben Zobrist had the biggest hit in Cubs history with an RBI double. The Cubs would score one more, and so would the Indians, as the Cubs ended the longest drought in American sports history and broke the curse with the Billy Goat. As already mentioned, this is easily going in the S tier. And we move to 2017. This series featured the Dodgers making their first appearance since 1988 by beating the Diamondbacks, then the defending champion Cubs. And they went up against the Astros, who got there by beating the Red Sox and the Yankees. This is a series that lost some of its value for events that weren't even part of the series, and came out years later. The Astros cheating scandal does take some away from the series, though they supposedly didn't cheat in the series. But regardless, just based on what happened, it's still an incredible series. Chris Taylor led off the series with a home run for the Dodgers, then Justin Turner added a 2-run of his own, as Clayton Kershaw arguably had the best postseason start of his career. Game 2 was an absolute classic and somehow not the best game of the series. The Astros added a run in the 8th to make it a 1-run game, and this was important in the 9th, when seemingly out of nowhere, Marwin Gonzalez hit a game-tying home run on Kenley Jansen. Things went to the 10th, when Jose Altuve hit the first of 3 go-ahead home runs in the 9th or later in the postseason in his career. Carlos Correa added another right after, with both being hit off the man Yordan Alvarez was traded for. But as would be common in the series, the Dodgers responded with 2 of their own in the bottom half, with a solo home run and RBI single. But then, George Springer hit a 2-run home run in the 11th. And though the Dodgers responded with a solo home run in the bottom half, they couldn't get another run home. The Astros scored 4 in the 2nd in Game 3, which was enough despite late rallies from the Dodgers. And despite the final score, Game 4 was actually tied 1-1 going into the 9th, until the Dodgers scored 5 in the 9th, sparked by a go-ahead double by Bellinger. And then there was the Game 5, maybe the wildest game in World Series history. For a quick overview like Game 6 in 2011, just look at the win probability chart. It's an absolute roller coaster ride going up and down, and never staying in one spot for long. And in comparing to a game like Game 6 and other great back and forth games, what's wild about this one is that 3 times a team erased a 3-run deficit in 1 inning. That happening even once in a World Series game would make it an incredible game. But for it to happen 3 times, along with another 1-run deficit overcame in an inning, along with a walk-off, and this being a crucial Game 5, it probably is the wildest World Series game in history. Game 6 involved another massive 1-inning lead change. Justin Verlander looked like he was going to cruise to his first World Series win to give the Astros the same feat. But then in the 6th, a huge Chris Taylor double and a Corey Seager sac fly changed the momentum that went even further to the Dodgers after a Jock Peterson solo home run in the 7th. Kenley Jansen completed a 6-out save to send us to a Game 7 that was just bound to happen. Game 7 started with the Astros scoring more runs in the first than they did throughout all of Game 6, thanks in part to a George Springer double and a Bellinger error. Then in the 2nd, the Astros scored 3, thanks in main part to a massive 2-run home run by George Springer, which tied the record set by Chase Utley and Reggie Jackson for home runs in a World Series. Then after this game just felt absolutely over. And with Charlie Morton coming in and cruising, it was over, as the Astros won their first World Series. From the time after the series until after the scandal leaked, there were debates on if this was the greatest series ever, and it deserves to be up there. And though we now immediately think of the Astros cheating when we bring up 2017, from a pure baseball perspective, this series was incredible. I'm putting it in the S tier. And we move to 2018 for another series that featured the Dodgers. They got there by defeating the Braves and the Brewers, and they went up against the 108-win Red Sox, who beat the Yankees, then the Astros. In Games 1 and 2, the Dodgers either tied the game or had the lead early, but eventually, the Red Sox broke through both times, to win each pretty convincingly. Then Game 3 gave us the most memorable game of the series, simply because of how insanely long it was. Through the first 9 innings, only 2 runs were scored, both on solo home runs hit by Jock Peterson and Jackie Bradley Jr., and things went to extras with that score. And after Ian Kinsler had a wild trip around the bases, the score remained until the 13th, when Eduardo Nunez hit an absolute bomb that trickled down the first base line. He made it to first, and Brock Holt scored on the error. And in the bottom half, it was the same story, as an infield single and a throwing error led to the tying run. What we most learned from this game was how great postseason Nathan Eovaldi was, giving up 0 earned runs from the 12th to the 17th. But the Dodgers bullpen matched him, and despite the resilient effort by him and both teams, the game ended on a Max Muncy walk-off in the 18th, 7 hours and 20 minutes after first pitch, by far the longest World Series game of all time. Despite the marathon game, they came back the next night, and the low scoring continued with no run scoring until the 6th, when Yasiel Puig hit a 3-run home run to put the Dodgers up by 4. But the Red Sox finally put runs on the board after a 3-run home run from Mitch Moreland and a solo home run by Steve Pearce to tie the game. Then they exploded for 5 runs in the 9th. The Dodgers added 2 of their own to give us a final score that doesn't tell the full story. Then in Game 5, Steve Pearce hit a 2-run home run off Kershaw, and the Red Sox never lost the lead, as they won their 9th World Series. Ultimately, aside from Game 3, this series seemed to be pretty forgettable, and could have been so much better considering that the Dodgers could have won all of these games. I'm putting this in the C tier. And we move to 2019. The Astros made their 2nd pennant in 3 years after beating the Rays, then Jose Altuve sent the Astros to the World Series with a walk-off home run in Game 6. And they went up against the Washington Nationals, who made the first World Series appearance by beating the Brewers, then the Dodgers, then the Cardinals. This was one of the weirdest World Series of all time, and that's mainly because the home team lost every game in the series, which hadn't happened in any 7-game series in American sports prior, and Game 1 may have been the best game of the series. Juan Soto became the 4th youngest player to hit a home run, which tied the game at 2. Then 1 inning later, he hit a 2-run double to put the Nationals up by 3. The Astros made a late comeback, including George Springer hitting a home run in his 5th straight World Series game, but it wasn't enough, as the Nationals won their first World Series game in franchise history. Game 2 was actually tied at 2 for the first 6 innings, but then the Nationals exploded for 6 in the 7th for their 8th straight win. Things went to Washington, D.C. for the first World Series in D.C. since 1933, and the Astros scored a run in the 2nd and the 3rd, along with the 5th and the 6th, which was enough, as the Nationals only scored 1 run despite 9 hits to end their winning streak. The next 2 games are easily won by the Astros by 6 runs or more, taking things back to Houston with Verlander and Strasburg on the mound. Alex Bregman and Juan Soto traded awkward bat flips to their first base coach, with Soto's home run being the difference, after Anthony Rendon hit a 2-run home run in the 7th after a controversial call in the same inning. The Nationals scored 2 more to send things to a Game 7. And in that Game 7, Zach Greinke was pitching the game of his life, giving up just 1 hit until the 7th, when Anthony Rendon hit a home run to cut the lead in half. After walking Soto, he was taken out, and this led to some debate when Howie Kendrick hit a 2-run go-ahead home run, the 13th biggest play in MLB history by championship win probability. The Nationals would add 3 more to win their first World Series. Of the 7-game series in the 21st century, I think this may be the worst, mainly because 5 of these games were decided by 4 runs or less. The road team winning every game may be the most memorable part, along with the surge of a young Juan Soto. And when the Astros cheating leaked later that year, the Nationals run was looked at even more fondly. I had a hard time deciding if this should be in the A or the B tier. Although there was a lack of serious drama, the resilience showed by both teams added to it, and the final scores don't tell the full story. I'm putting this in the A tier. And we move to 2020 for another weird World Series, and that's because of the pandemic that caused a limited amount of fans to be allowed in Globe Life Field. And it's a shame because this was a pretty good series that would have been much better with full crowds. This series featured the Dodgers making their 3rd appearance in 4 years by beating the Brewers, then the Padres, then the Braves. And they went up against the Rays, who beat the Blue Jays, then the Yankees, then the Astros. Game 1 was won pretty decidingly by the Dodgers, but the Rays responded in Game 2, tying a World Series record for team strikeouts in a game, which was 15, the same amount the Dodgers had in their 18-inning game. Randy Arozarena tied the record for home runs in a postseason in Game 3, but the Rays lost after a great performance by Walker Buehler. Then there was the Game 4. Obviously the final play is most remembered, but this game was back and forth throughout the whole night. There were 25 hits in this game, with 6 of those being home runs, and there was a lead change every inning from the 6th to the 9th, with Corey Seager looking like he had the deciding hit. But then, that final play, Kershaw gave one of the best performances of his career given the circumstances. Then Game 6 gave us the lasting legacy of this series, when Blake Snell was pulled in the 6th in a 1-0 game, despite throwing only 73 pitches with little stress. We wouldn't have cared that much if it worked out, but it didn't, and the Dodgers scored 2 runs that inning. Then Mookie Betts added a home run, as the Dodgers won their first World Series since 1988. Like I said, this was a good World Series that unfortunately has a lot taken away from it because of a situation out of control of the players. I'm putting this in the C tier, and it's only there because of the competitiveness. And we move to 2021, which featured an Astros return after they beat the White Sox and the Red Sox, and they went up against the Braves, making their first appearance of the century after beating the Brewers and the Dodgers. Jorge Soler made history by becoming the first to ever lead off the World Series with a home run, and the Braves added 4 more through the third and won pretty convincingly. Game 2 was a pretty similar story, except the Astros won this pretty convincingly. The story of Game 3 was the Braves pitching that kept the Astros hitless through the first 7 innings. The Astros would finally get a hit in the 8th, and the Braves would add another run to win 2-0. Game 4 easily gave us the best game of the series. Dylan Lee actually made his first MLB start in this game and gave up a run in the first. The Astros kept a close lead until the 7th inning, then future no-hitter starter Christian Javier gave up back-to-back home runs to Dansby Swanson and Jorge Soler, which would be the difference as the Braves won 3-2. Game 5 started with an Adam Duvall grand slam, and it looked certain that the Braves were winning the World Series at home. But then the Astros slowly chipped away at the lead. 1 inning after Zach Greinke became the last full-time pitcher to record a hit, the Astros tied the game in the 5th, then took the lead in the same inning, and never lost it again as things went back to Houston. In Game 6, Max Fried went up against Luis Garcia, and things were scoreless until Jorge Soler hit a mammoth 3-run home run reminiscent of Albert Pujols. Though the Astros came back in the prior game, they couldn't this time, as the Braves tacked on 3 more in the 5th, then Freddie Freeman hit his final home run as a Brave in the 7th as the Braves won their 2nd World Series. This was a pretty good series that is most remembered for the big moments. I'm putting it in the crowded B tier. And we move to 2022 for another series featuring the Astros as they beat the Mariners, then the Yankees for their 2nd straight pennant, and they went up against the Phillies, who in the first year of the wildcard round made it from there by beating the Cardinals, then the defending champion Braves, then the Padres. Game 1 may have been the best game of the series. The favorite Astros jumped out to a 5-0 lead, but Justin Verlander guaranteed he wouldn't get his first World Series win when the Phillies came back from a 5-run deficit. The game remained 5-5, and things went to extras after a diving catch by Nick Castellanos. Then in the 10th, JT Realmuto hit a go-ahead home run that would be the difference as the Astros failed to score with a runner on second in the bottom half. Game 2 was probably the most forgettable game, with a great game pitched by Framber Valdez and a relatively low-stress win for the Astros. Things went to Philly, and just like the last 2 World Series in Philly, there was a rain delay that delayed the game for a day. And the story of Game 3 was the 5 Philly home runs that tied the single-game team record. And Game 4 was the exact opposite for the Phillies, as for the 2nd time in World Series history, a no-hitter was thrown, this one being the first combined no-hitter. Game 5, in my opinion, was the best given the circumstances. Both teams scored in the first, then Jeremy Pena's home run put Verlander in line for his first World Series win, and both teams scored in the 8th to keep the possible win still intact. Then in the 9th, Realmuto hit a drive to right center. Then Chas McCormick made one of the best catches in World Series history to prevent a triple or even an inside-the-park home run, as the Astros held on to win. Then Game 6 was a scoreless pitcher's duel until the 6th, when Kyle Schwarber hit a solo home run. Then in the bottom half, Zach Wheeler came out of the game. Then Yordan Alvarez hit a towering 3-run home run to center that in the moment felt like it ended the World Series. And with only one more run being scored, it did. And the Astros won their 2nd World Series. Obviously, it's hard to judge such a recent World Series, but I think over time, this series will age well. Game 1 and 5 were intense, Game 3 and 4 were historic, and Game 6 had one of the biggest home runs of the decade. This may be a hot take, but for now, I'm putting it in the A tier. And we finally get to our final most recent World Series, featuring the first AL team to make it from the wildcard round, the Texas Rangers, who beat the Rays, then the Orioles, then the defending champion Astros. And they went up against another wildcard team in the Arizona Diamondbacks, who beat the Brewers, then the Dodgers, then the Phillies. As we all just saw, Game 1 was one of the best openers ever. It was very back and forth to start, with the Diamondbacks controlling much of the game. But then, Globe Life Corey had arguably the biggest swing of his career, with a game-tying 2-run home run. Then after both escaped scoring threats in the 10th, in the bottom of the 11th, Adolis Garcia would hit a walk-off home run to set a postseason record for RBIs. Unfortunately, Game 1 was the massive peak of the series. Game 2 was a blowout, Game 3 was close, but the Diamondbacks could not make the most of their chances. Game 4 was another blowout despite a late rally from the Diamondbacks, and Game 5 was a pitcher's duel, with Zach Gallen throwing 6 no-hit innings, while Nathan Eovaldi seemingly got out of a jam every inning. The shutout and no-hitter ended in the 7th, with an RBI single by Mitch Garver. Then the Rangers scored 4 in the 9th to finish 11-0 on the road and win their first World Series. Obviously, once again, it's hard to judge a World Series that just ended, but right now, this series is absolutely carried by the Game 1. I'm putting this in the D tier. So after looking at the World Series of the 21st century, we saw some of the best ever, and naturally, some forgettable ones. Many of these were hard to put in tiers, which can change over time, and I'm sure some will disagree with the choices, biases aside. And we'll come back to this next year after the MLB scriptwriters come up with another storyline.